Well, our lesson for this evening is going to be a continuation of our study from Sunday on chapter 9 of Lord, Sometimes I Don't Feel Saved. We're revisiting, by John's writing, some of this idea of false teachers again a little bit more closely, like we did in some of the first chapters. John is bringing his audience back around to this topic to give them some more insight on how to identify those false teachers. We spent some time about security of the faith in the meantime, and now we're coming back to some of those guys who are wanting to give them insecurity. Question 1 is evaluate the 2 tests John gave his readers for locating false teachers in terms of their usefulness for the Christian today. The passage in our actual, as far as the book of 1 John here, is in chapter 4 and the first 6 verses. In terms of the textbook here, it's on pages 88 and then 89. The 2 questions, the 2 tests that we are to apply to teachers to see if they're false teachers are first, does the teaching state that Jesus was God? And second, do the teachers continue to teach the apostles' teaching? And those are the 2 things that John wants them to evaluate. So let's look at that in the context of the verses where we read from, and then we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. So verse 1 says, "Beloved, stop believing every spirit, rather try the spirits to determine whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Every spirit that has come in the flesh, every spirit that does not thus acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and is now already in the world. You are from God, little children, and you have overcome them, because greater is the one who is in you than the one who is in the world. They are from the world, and on account of this they speak from the world, and the world hears them. We are from God. The one who knows God hears us. He who is not from God does not hear us. And on account of this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error." So again, we're looking for this Antichrist spirit, the one who opposes God's anointed one, who says that Jesus was not God, and so on, and whether or not they continue on in the apostolic teaching. The false teachers said Jesus wasn't God, Christ didn't come in the flesh, and then the false teachers will not listen to the message being proclaimed by the apostles from the beginning. John has already indicated that one of the marks of the saved person is abiding in that apostolic teaching. The second part of this lesson, though, besides just talking about these 2 tests, was how useful are they for the Christian today? I think the first is very useful, just in terms of finding out if someone is indeed professing to be a Christian to begin with. Now remember, the problem with the guys that John was preaching against, and that this letter is written about, is not that they were pretending to be something else, but that they were in fact supposing and presenting themselves as Christian teachers, while still saying at the same time that Jesus was not God. And that might seem like an obvious contradiction to us, but to them it posed a conflict from their worldview. They couldn't see a perfect spiritual being like God interfering with the flawed flesh of the human body. They saw a contradiction there, and that was how they made up for that, was by teaching that Jesus could not have been God in the flesh. And second, it's probably the most practical test for us. It's probably the one that we'll have to think the hardest about applying, I think, because it's also the one we should be applying to ourselves. How closely are we following the apostles' doctrine and the apostles' example in the Bible? How closely are we doing what the New Testament church was doing? That should be a constant process. Anytime you come across an assumption, you should test that assumption. Leave no assumption undisturbed. Now, there's kind of a life cycle of teaching, right? It starts out with a fresh idea, whether that's for you or for a group of people, brand new. And so every time it comes into your life, you're thinking about where it rests. What does it touch? How does it act, right? So if God says don't perform a particular sin, every time that sin shows up in somebody else, the temptation shows up in you, you actually perform that sin, you have just learned that that is wrong, it sticks out in your mind, it prickles you, it shows up. Now over time, you take it for granted that that's the right thing to do, and so it slumps off. It's not that it's no longer important, but it's just not top of mind. You take it for granted people know that that's not something you're supposed to do. And then eventually, some of the trappings of that assumption get stuck to it. So let's say, for example, we'll take the biblical example of drunkenness, right? So the Bible teaches us very clearly, don't drink alcohol for drunkenness. Don't consume things to lose your sobriety, stay in control of your mind, and act properly at all times. Now, over time, the traditions that get stuck to that are just, well, it's better to just avoid alcohol because you don't want to seem like a person who gets drunk. You don't want to accidentally get drunk. Now, all of those are perfectly fine things to apply to yourself as an individual, but they're not biblical teachings. So you can hold those as things that you think are important, they're your personal values, but you can't burden them on somebody else because the Bible doesn't teach them. But somewhere down the line, those assumptions get lumped into traditions, and nobody's questioning them anymore because they're stuck to the teachings just as much as any other biblical teaching. They're assumed to be true. So, now, am I advocating that we all go down to Applebee's, have some margaritas after this is over? No, that is not the point of what I'm saying. It was just a convenient example. What I'm saying is that if we take everything that we have been taught as it was delivered to us without shaking the traditions off of it and looking for the scriptural passage underneath it, we're not going back to the apostles' doctrine. We're going to preacher's doctrine. We're going to our grandfather's doctrine. We're going to the teacher that we bought a book from last week's doctrine. And we're not going back to the Bible. And that should be the test we're always applying. Like I said, I think the first test is really easy. If someone straight up just tells you they don't think Jesus was God, you can reason with that person. You can try to show them from Scripture and demonstrate who Jesus was based on the things he did and why, if you believe that the Bible is true, in every other aspect, leaving out Jesus' divinity doesn't make any sense, right? You can have those kinds of discussions. So as a litmus test, it's pretty cut and dried, I find. But the other one is harder to apply because I think we also have to apply it to ourselves. And it's a little bit of that, remove the log from your own eye so you can take the speck of sawdust out of your brother's eye. Now you notice in Jesus telling that, I didn't say this on Sunday even though I referenced that then. When Jesus told people that, he didn't say, ignore the sawdust. He just said, take the log out. There is room for correction, but you can't be a hypocrite and provide correction. There is room to say, now I've examined myself and I know I've got problems too, but I think I can help you with yours. And there's a spirit of humility and love that comes into that and say, I'm not saying I'm better than you and let me lift you up to my level. What I'm saying is we both got some stuff going on here and I think I can help you out. And with that humility in mind, there is correction that's able to take place. But in this particular context where we're talking about false teachers, it's more about receiving a message and, as John puts it, testing the spirits to find the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Find the words that are true and the words that aren't. Before we go on to question number 2 and start talking about the only way up, and just a little bit of a piece of information that may not be entirely helpful right now, but I think is somewhat relevant. The word for spirit and the word for breath are the same word in our Greek New Testament. The word pneuma, which means the breath that fills your lungs, the breath that makes you alive. Not just wind, but the breath of life. That's the same word that's used of the Holy Spirit. It's the word that's used in here to test the spirits. Whenever there's this sort of idea of the activity that's taking place, the breath that's being exchanged as this is moving and living, that's the thing you're testing. It's the spirit, it's the breath, it's the words that are being propelled by the breath. Those are all kind of encapsulated in that poetic idea of spirit there, which is also, spiritually true idea of spirit. I'm not saying poetic in that it's only figurative. But anyway, that's the idea there I wanted to convey. Like I said, I don't know if that particular tip is helpful right now, but I thought it was worth passing on regardless. I think it'll gain more relevance as we get forward. Question number 2 says, examine the following passages where only begotten occurs in the Greek New Testament and determine which translation, unique or one of a kind, fits each passage. Let's go ahead and start with Luke 7 and verse 12. That's the first one for us here. And look at what's being said there. Luke 7 and verse 12 reads, as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. Now, I probably should have got my King James Version so that I could read you that only begotten there, but I think we know what word's being translated differently in my NIV here. So, the way the NIV says it, that's that the only son of his mother, that's the only begotten. That's the monogenes. It's the one and only, right? Our translation there is that he is a unique son in the sense that he's the one and only son. Now that's different from the way it was being used of Jesus, right? Because Jesus was the one of a kind, unique son, and not the only son who had been born. But that's one of the things about language. Language has a range of meaning, and the context changes on how we read different things. It's my favorite version is that if you saw a newspaper headline about pandas, and it describes them as eat shoots and leaves, and they didn't put any, they put a comma in the wrong spot there, you would think that he just killed somebody on his way out the door, but he's eating bamboo. He's eating the shoots and the leaves instead of eating, But the whole point of what I'm trying to say is the context in which we read these words sometimes matters. If you ignore my stupid joke, we'll go ahead on the next one, which is in verse 42 of chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 42 of Luke says, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. And this is talking about Jairus, the synagogue leader who came and asked Jesus to save his daughter. So once again, this is the one and only. He only has one child. She's very special to him. Not that she's a unique child, but that she is his only child. So that's a particular context where that word is being used differently than our passage in John, 1 John. So let's go ahead and continue to John's Gospel. And in John's Gospel, chapter 1 and verse 14, we see this. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, that's the one next there, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So now we have our other translation, the one and only, the special, the unique, right? The one of a kind. Not that he is necessarily the only child of God, the only son of God, but that he's in a special category. And John is using that in the midst of this passage where he's talking about this light that is coming to man. He's talking about God in his divinity coming down to earth to be among people. And so that's why that's important. Then also in verse 18 of that same chapter, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, hath made him known. So, God, the monogenes, Jesus, in the form of the one and only, that unique form, has made God known to people. The next place this shows up should be very familiar to us is John 3:16. Now this verse is in the middle of Jesus talking to Nicodemus. Now I know we love John 3:16, we quote that all the time, but it's important to remember this is Jesus himself speaking. When he's talking about himself to Nicodemus, one of the Pharisees, he says to him, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." That one and only, that monogenes, that unique Son, the special Son, is understood to be Jesus here, because Jesus is talking about himself to this teacher. Now, Nicodemus would have described himself as being the Son of God. That was a term that the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, were comfortable about with using for themselves, because they were descended from Adam and from Abraham, and their proud lineage came all the way down from God himself. He was the great progenitor father who started all of creation, and they were part of the chosen people who could trace their lineage all the way back to God. That was something Jewish people were comfortable saying. Now, what they don't want to say about themselves is they're Son of Man, because the Son of Man is a reference to the prophecy of Daniel. And the Son of Man in the prophecy of Daniel is understood to be God. And he's understood to be, rather, the Messiah, a special one chosen by God, which has this certain blasphemous quality to it if you're not deserving of that title, like they think you're supposed to be. So when Jesus calls himself Son of Man, that's what gets him in trouble with the Jews. Son of God is a title that all Hebrews get to claim. That's special for them. He's one of the chosen people. The Son of Man has extra sort of connotation to it.
In this reference right here, Jesus is making even a further reference to the only Son of God.
Correct. So he's saying that he's the special and unique Son of God. He's in a different category from all the other people who would claim that title. Exactly right. And that's why our version of the Bible typically capitalizes the S there, because they want to emphasize the deity of Jesus, and they'll say that's his title in the Trinity, is the capital S, for sure. In verse 18 of that same passage, the word gets used again. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe in him stands condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. This unique, this special Son. And now, remember why that matters, that Jesus is not only begotten in the sense that he's the only one who gets the title of Son of God. God, and through his apostles later on, many times will call us adopted children. He wants us to take on that title of being his children. It's something that he says multiple times. It's something that we are worthy of because he has made us worthy. It's something he wants us to accept. We shouldn't reject the idea of being God's children just because Jesus is a special Son above us in his own category. There's no humility in telling God, no, don't call me that. Or might as well be like Peter saying, don't wash my feet, Jesus. Because God is giving you the honor of being one of his children. So take it. Don't tell God what place he needs to be in and what honor he can or can't give you. But in saying that, we're looking here at the category that Jesus is in and how he's unique. So Hebrews 11:17, we see that word used again, but not of Jesus this time. By faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Now, somebody who's good with Bible history, Bible trivia, how many children did Abraham have? was not one. Ishmael was his son. He was older than Isaac. He had 3 other sons with his second wife after Sarah. So Isaac is not Abraham's one and only son. He's not his only begotten in that sense. He's his special, unique son of the promise. Isaac is the one that God said, I will do great things through, because God said to Abraham, I will do great things through your son Isaac, because he's the child of promise. He's the one and only, he's the unique son through whom all of these things will be fulfilled, because your faith has been counted as righteousness. This is the product of your faith and your covenant with me. So Isaac has been put in a special category. Even though those other sons exist, even so, though they're legitimate sons of Abraham, in the case of his younger sons, Isaac's, half-brothers, the legitimacy of Ishmael and Hagar in that relationship is questionable, but the other ones were one of Abraham's actual legitimate wives with whom he had children on purpose, in order to procreate, not just to sort of circumvent God's promise and get out ahead of it before Isaac could be born, like with Ishmael. But Ishmael was still in that special category. So that's the lesson we're learning here today. We're chosen, intentionally created, wanted, loved children of God, but we're not Isaac. We're not Jesus. We're not in that special category, if you take it. And finally, we've got the last place to look, which is earlier in the chapter, earlier in the book from where we had been reading presently, it's in the same passage we were just reading, rather. It's actually a little bit later on, which is in verse 9. And why don't we just go ahead and get that next passage of Scripture. Starting in verse 7 of 1 John chapter 4. Beloved, let us continue to love one another, because love is from God, and everyone who practices love has been begotten from God and knows God. The one who does not practice love has not known God, because God is love. And this God made clear in this. Trying to read it across 2 pages, messed me up. This is how God made clear his love among us. God has sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. And this is love. Not that we love God, but that he loved us, and he sent his Son as a propitiation for our sins. Beloved, God loved us in this way. We ought to love one another. No one has ever beheld God, but if we love one another, God remains in us, and his love reaches maturity in us. So he says, the one who loves has been begotten from God and knows God. But that Jesus is the one and only. He is the only man. He's the special category son. So he's calling us, even in this passage, sons and daughters of God. But Jesus' capital S sonship is a different category of being. Any comments or questions on what we reviewed there before we continue on? I think so too. I mean, I think it needs a little bit of digging up. It's a surface level reading might let a person think of Jesus as the only one who gets to be called God's Son. And I think the apostles really don't want us to think of that way. I think, especially in what John just said right there, anyone who loves has been born of God, has been begotten of God. God is your Father too. Just a different type of status of Jesus. And because of that, when we get to question 3, and we're starting to talk about loving one another and what that looks like, and trying to get to perfect love or mature love, as we talked about on Sunday, we are talking about what that is going to look like. So let me read a few sentences here from page 91 of the book before we read this question and try and answer it. Starting about near the top there, he said, we are sons and daughters of God, but Jesus' sonship is different. God made his love very clear to us by giving his unique one-of-a-kind Son. He gave himself as a propitiation for our sins. Moving on down the page here, he says, when we love one another, his love is perfected in us, the King James Version. The word perfect in the King James Version seldom, if ever, means without error. It rather means complete, whole, mature, or reaching its intended goal. When I love my brother, one of God's goals in loving me is accomplished, and I move towards maturity. So, define mature love in the way in which it responds to God in the world, and fill in the blanks with fear, habit, or love. So, for a mature response to question 3, I think that it's not immature for the answer for A to be fear. I don't think that, especially for someone who's just starting a new relationship with God, I don't think that reflects any kind of weakness or lack of awareness. I think, in fact, if you start out by having fear that turns into reverence and awe for God, I think that is rather healthy, because it goes from, I'm afraid of the consequences, to I'm now in awe of the reverence and awe and filled with reverence for the individual. Now, you could say that that's, there's probably a better way to approach that, but I think a lot of people start with fear, so I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But when we get to part B, it says, now my Christian walk grows out of love. I think that's the expected answer there. And question 4 really just kind of helps us to expand on the answers for these. So I'll go ahead and we'll have our discussion after that. Discuss the significance of the various answers to question 3 for living the Christian life. So, as far as the 3 answers go, I already mentioned fear. If we say habit, when I became a Christian, I was motivated primarily by habit. I wonder, what kind of a person would we call that, who decided to become a Christian out of some sort of idea of habit or maybe obligation, we could say?
What was the question?
I was just saying, if we fill in answer part A of question 3 with habit, when I became a Christian, I was motivated primarily by habit. What kind of a person would we be describing, do you think? What kind of situation might they be in?
Probably more someone that was raised in the church, somebody that had that example in front of them the whole time. Maybe not necessarily full commitment to it. They just went through the motions.
Sure, this is the way things are around here or in my family or so forth. And there are a lot of people who start out that way and they grow to a deeper understanding, and I think that that's a perfectly understandable path. How many other things do we do out of habit or out of, sort of conformity to our surroundings, especially when we're young? I've told this story before, but I'll tell you the short version. There's this story that went around for a long time of the young lady asks her mom, why do we cut the ends off the ham before we put it in the oven? And she said, I don't know, that's what my mom always did. So they called grandma, and grandma said, well, that's what great-grandma always did. And they called great-grandma, and they said, great-grandma, why don't we just cut the ends off the ham before we put it in the oven? Great-grandma says, that's how big my pan was. So we get these sort of habits, based on what we've seen, and that's just the way it always was. And I think in our faith it can be the same thing. This is expected of me. This is the right thing to do because everybody's looking.
In some cases it can be pressure.
Yes, and I think that's another way to express it. Yes, pressure, and just social expectations. Sorry, please continue. Oh, I had something else to say. I'm sorry. I misread that. That's my fault. But, and the pressure, I know some people who were coached into baptism because their family was like, well, it's about time you kids get to it. because their friends, the kids their age were getting baptized. I'm not saying it was insincere. I'm not saying that they didn't understand what was going on or have an idea of their own sin, or that it would illegitimize their baptism in any way. But the circumstances around it made it less of a decision out of their own hands as much as it was sort of the product of the environment they were in. So I know I'm kind of saying two things at once here. I'm really not trying to be a politician about this, I promise. But I'm just saying I think it's possible to make the right choice out of less than ideal circumstances. And fear is honestly one of those too. So let's get to the other answer possible for question A. If we say, when I became a Christian, I was motivated primarily by love. Now, what kind of a person is going to be able to answer that question, do you think? And when I became a Christian, I was motivated primarily by love. What kind of place in their life are they going to be in to be able to answer the question that way?
It would be an older person.
Yeah. At the very least, they're an emotionally mature person. Probably older. They probably got a little bit more life experience behind them. I think it'd be entirely possible for it to be a young person if they saw a positive Christian example around them. They were raised to know the love of God from a young age. It might be possible, instead of saying, I'm afraid of hell, to go, I can't stand to be without Jesus. And to have that love for God and want to be a part of a relationship with Him. I honestly think that I was about 50-50 between those two options when I got baptized. There was a little bit of the, I love my Christian family, I cannot stand to be away from them. I want to be in heaven with them forever. And it's kind of that mix of like, I don't want the consequences of sin. I don't want to be guilty of these things that I know I've done. And also, I don't want to miss out. This is such a good thing I want to be part of forever. I think that was probably where, like I said, I think I was 16 years old when I got baptized. So I was in a different place than a lot of my friends who got baptized at 11, and they were just motivated by whatever motivates 11-year-olds. So, this would be an interesting conversation to have with them. I'm not sure that ever crossed my mind to ask.
I could see, growing up in the church, the hellfire and brimstone sermons that I've heard throughout my life being a motivator from the fear aspect. But then I think about, if I were to have a conversation with Jesus and He was trying to tell me what I needed to do to be saved, would He be telling me because He wanted me to be fearful of it? Or would He tell me because He's concerned for my well-being and there's more of a love, more of a reverential thing?
I think you're absolutely right. And the times you look at Jesus' life on earth and the times He did use fear was about people already unknown there. He was always trying to put the fear into teachers and people who ought to have already figured all this out by now. And He's always kind of getting in their face and saying, why don't you get it? Aren't you afraid? You're going to be thrown into outer darkness. Woe upon you. He recites woes upon these false, these teachers who were opposing Him.
Well, if He does mention it, it's in a sermon, to a group that already should know the Scriptures. He fulfilled those Scriptures. He fulfilled the prophecies in the Scriptures. They should know, but they've taken it in a different light. They've taken it the wrong way. And He's correcting them for that. It's kind of you're fearful in some aspect, but it's more of I want to do the right thing.
Yes, absolutely. Which gets us to the second question. Part B says, now my Christian walk, and I answer that, grows out of love. And I think that's the only sort of healthy answer of those three options. If you're already a Christian, it better be love that's motivating you to go forward. But let's talk about the other two and what kind of a position people might be if those are their answers. Now my Christian walk grows out of fear. What kind of a place in their life would a person have to be to answer that way? I mean, it's not really growth, is it? And either way, if you put either one of these answers, my Christian walk continues maybe out of fear. Now, there are some people who, I mean, Lord bless them, I hope they find some sort of relief. And many of them have already passed on, who I know anytime you ask, are you going to heaven? They would say, well, or something along that line. When it comes up, they'd say, well, you know, I hope at the end of the day, He finds me worthy. I hope I make it. And if I manage to kind of, like God's going to be slamming the door, they got to put their foot in before He shuts the pearly gates on them. You know, that exists. There's definitely a category of people, and they need help. I think they need as much help as some of the lost people, honestly, because they feel lost on this side of salvation. I think it's a terrible place to be in.
Well, it's the doubt that Satan puts in your mind that God's not really going to do what God said He would do. And I've known many people that way. I mean, my mother was that way. You know, she was, I hope, Lord, you know, there's more we know. You know, there's so many verses that have that salvation in the past tense. Like, we are already saved. And I don't think it was taught well for decades.
And there was, unfortunately, a very specific motivation behind that was part of the culture of the time that we don't really talk about, which was that church service was something that was performed daily. Clergy, for decades, for centuries, had been noblemen and then merchants, and anybody who had money went off to school, got a degree in stuff you couldn't read, and told you how to be a believer. And so it was like, get in line, be a good little part of the community, so that you can be a productive part of my profit stream. And now, that is not to vilify anybody, but there was an inherent motivator of, you know, the upper class dictating to the lower class what faith was. One of the best things I think that came out of our movement, out of the Restoration movement, was that it was started by what it was basically the middle class of the United States right before the Civil War. And the idea was, we're going to tell each other. A bunch of immigrants came into the country, a bunch of people from the British Isles, and started telling everybody, okay, this is what we need to do to start fixing our own religion for ourselves. You and me to you. There was this sort of layman clergy where anybody who figured out how to read the Bible could teach it. And we've kept that tradition up really well. Now, I don't want to just talk about tradition, but I think the reason why I'm bringing that up is if there's any motivation to be carried forward from that movement, it's to hold on to that sort of equality that comes from making sure nobody's excluded from salvation, from the ability to understand their own salvation, and to quote-unquote work it out with fear and trembling, which should be really translated to render reverence and awe instead, I think. That there is an ability for every individual to approach and to do the work of salvation in their own lives, because by doing that you demonstrate how effective God is at saving people. How is the gospel going to work in my life if I see Christians and all that they do is mope about how they don't feel saved? How am I, as a non-believer, going to be convinced that those Christians have a right idea when none of them seem to be convinced? But if we can have the understanding that we are free of the fear of condemnation in our own lives, I think that gives great value that we can pass on. So if we can eliminate the hellfire and brimstone, which I think, by and large, that's kind of going the way of the dinosaur at this point, we are now left with, I think, the only other option, which unfortunately continues to creep in. My Christian walk is motivated, continues out of habit. A lot of people, for whatever reason, go into habit, and they continue on because that's just the way things are supposed to be. It's a routine. There is something to be said about rituals and routines and doing things in a certain way and keeping structures. If nothing else, it just keeps things tidy. You can know what to expect every time. That's why we have an order of worship and so forth. But this is just like what we were talking about at the beginning of class. Sometimes it's worth undoing all of those traditions, habits, routines, and rituals, things that aren't actually part of what the Bible tells us to do, just to figure out which ones we want to keep. Sometimes it's worth just taking it all the way back to the bare minimum and then building back out whatever is uplifting. And sometimes it's something we do on a congregation level, sometimes it's something we do on an individual level. I tell you, one of the biggest changes for me was starting to write a daily devotional every day. Prior to that, I'm not ashamed to tell you, and I think I've even said it before, I did not have a daily Bible study habit on my own. I did not have the habit of opening the Bible every day and reading it and trying to find out what God wanted me to say. Read and learn that. No. I would read the Bible occasionally when I thought of it, and preparing for some sermons and Bible lessons. Those are the only times I did any Bible study. Now that's hours worth of study. I'm not saying that's nothing. Just doing sermons and the Bible lessons. But it wasn't a habit. It wasn't something that I did on a regular basis. And adding that habit in has been uplifting rather than taking down. It's been something that's added to my life. But there are other kinds of habits that are less active. When I sit down to write a devotional every morning, you kind of got to put a little bit of brain power into that. If I just slap some Bible verses together, I might take things out of context. I might say something that the Bible doesn't say. I might go in with an idea of what I want to say and bring out parts of verses out of context and build a case for something that isn't real. So I always do what I always do. Go in and read the scripture first, find a relevant passage, and then talk on it, not the other way around. But that's not the same as, there are so many other things, I can't think of any right now, that can just feel empty if we do them without intent behind them. And I think that's what I want to say about question 5. Question 5 says, discuss how the church can help her members develop a mature love. So we're talking about mature love in this passage, about having God's love abiding in us and loving our brother. That's what mature love, perfect love looks like. It's when you love your brother, when you love one another. There is no way to do that by accident. You can be nice to somebody by accident. You can maybe even do good to somebody by accident. But love, in the way we've been talking about it in this book, as an idea of priority, you have to put somebody first. You have to do that on purpose. You have to maybe build up the instinct or build up the reflex to step back, put other people first, so that it's not, it's not always trying to get that time back and put people first after you've put yourself first. But what I'm trying to say with my awkward wording there is you have to be mindful of the decisions you're making before you make You have to have the intent, as you're walking your Christian walk, to think, what am I doing for the other guy? Before you do before you look out for number one, before you do what's right for you. I think that's the only way to love our brothers and to work towards that mature love, is to mindfully, intently look at each opportunity God gives us and pray about it. So, I have a little bit of an illustration for this, and I hope you can follow what I'm saying with this one. There's a practice of being able to control your dreams. It's called lucid dreaming. It's kind of like a fad for a few years back there, and it's faded back into obscurity. And I just, read some things about it and heard how people do it. I actually never ended up trying it myself because it's basically a form of self-hypnosis. When you're going to sleep, you have to wake yourself up at 5 a.m. for so many days in a row, interrupt your REM sleep, and then it's supposed to be after, like a week or so of doing that, when you go back to sleep at 5 a.m., suddenly you'll know you're in a dream, and you can control the sort of dreamlike hallucinations you're having at night. It puts you in a different state of mind. When you are practicing this, one of the things they teach you to do is while you're awake, you stop and look at your hands every once in a while. Because you can't see your hands in your dreams. Just a thing about dreams. You never have hands in your dreams. And if you try and look at them, they look like they're, TV static, or they're somebody else's hands. They never look real in your dreams. So that was something that stuck with me. And I just kind of picked up the habit of every once in a while, even though I never tried to, control my dreams, I just look at my hands. And I picked this up as this idea of you're here right now, what are you doing with these things? They're attached to the ends of your arms. You're supposed to be interacting with this world in a mindful way. You're supposed to be present right here and right now. And I've just picked up that habit of stopping and looking at my hands every once in a while to ground myself in the moment I'm actually in. And like I said, even though I've never tried to wake up in a dream and do anything silly like that, it has actually helped my waking life, my actual life, a lot. Because I'll every once in a while be in the middle of something, doing something with my hands, and think, why are they doing that? Why am I doing what I'm doing right now? Why is this thing I don't really want to, this time I'm wasting, this thing I'm doing, why is this what I'm doing with my hands? And it really breaks whatever little bubble that is, that lets you get distracted and get idle and get into things you don't want to do. Now, I'm not telling you so that you'll start doing that. I don't want you to pick up weird habits like me and everybody from this church going around looking at their hands. They'll think we're in some sort of a cult or something. But what I am saying is, if we are not stopping in the middle of some of our activities that we're just going through because we're going through them, and going, what am I doing right now? Where am I? What's going on? Who am I working for? Then the work you get done might not be the work you want to do. God has a lot of opportunities that He puts in front of us, moment to moment. And sometimes our hands busy doing other people's work besides His. And in order to prioritize our brother and love him, in order to love God and put Him first, we have to really manage what we're doing with our time with intent. Be mindful. Well, that's all I had to share. Any other further comments or questions? I appreciate your time and your participation today, everybody. I felt like we had a good discussion. We'll pick up on Sunday morning with chapter 10. Chapter 10, I actually didn't look that far forward. What's the title? God sits in the witness stand. God sits on the witness stand. So that's what we'll be looking at that time. All right, so that'll conclude our lesson for today.